Welcome, everybody. We're really glad that you're able to join us for this conversation today. My name is Wendy Chamberlain, and I'm a senior advisor for TrickleUp, leading TrickleUp's innovation and research strategy, for which this topic falls under. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping before we dive into the conversation today. We are going to have a few different speakers introduce themselves, and we're going to have some content shared, and then we'll have some time opened up for discussion. So while presentations are going on, we are glad to capture questions and comments in the chat, and then we will reserve some time, about 15-20 minutes at the end of the conversation, to have discussion. And we really look forward to your reactions, your insights to the content that we're going to share today. So today, what we're really excited about is to share with you some research that TrickleUp commissioned later last year, around November, to better understand this topic of women's digital agency, which is a strategic priority for TrickleUp. Many of us on this panel and many of us seeing names that I'm familiar with in the room have talked about the topic of women's use of digital, using smartphones, using applications for a really long time. And we perennially struggle with the issue of uptake and usage, but rarely do we talk about this concept of agency, women's agency in particular, when we are talking about women's use of phones and applications. So that is the focus of today's conversation. To kick us off, I'm going to turn this over to Lauren Hendricks, TrickleUp's CEO and president, to explain why this topic is of import to TrickleUp, and then we'll turn it over to the research. So Lauren, over to you.
Great, thanks. And Wendy, let me know if you guys can't hear me. But I'd like to say just good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I know people are joining us from all over the world, and we're so happy to have you all. I'm really excited for TrickleUp to be hosting this conversation today. It's about a topic that I am passionate about and that I really feel is becoming increasingly important for the future of economic inclusion programming, and that is digital agency. Specifically, we really want to talk about what digital agency means in the lives of women who are living in poverty, how it develops, and what it means for how we as practitioners should be designing and measuring our programming. Over the last decade, we've seen huge investments in digital inclusion, and millions more women now have access to phones, to digital financial services, and to online information. But we've also really learned, I think, that access alone is not enough. We learned that when women have a phone, when they have a phone in their hands, it doesn't necessarily translate that she can use it freely, that she can use it confidently, safely, or that she can use it in ways that advance her own aspirations. At TrickleUp, we have a working definition of digital agency as a woman's ability to access, use, and ultimately control the digital tools in ways that improve her life and expand her choices. Our digital strategy is really rooted in the simple belief: digital technologies have enormous potential to accelerate economic inclusion, but only if women are able to use those tools on their own terms. And for us, that means moving beyond questions of access alone and understanding the broader ecosystems in women's digital lives. What are her capabilities, the material realities she faces, and the social norms that shape what's possible? And that's precisely why we partnered with Quicksand on this research. We wanted to move beyond simple measures of phone ownership or even use to better understand what enables or constrains women's digital agency over time. We really hope that today's discussion contributes not only to TrickleUp's work, but also to the broader conversation I feel like the field is starting to have around how we can design, measure, and support digital inclusion in ways that truly center on women. And with that, I'm really pleased to turn it over to our colleagues at Quicksand. I think you'll find their findings as exciting as I did after the research. So with that, over to you guys.
Thanks, Lauren. So just a little bit, a few words about this research and how how TrickleUp approached it with Quicksand, and then I'll turn it over to Babitha George, the director of Quicksand. So because this topic is a newer topic, both to the field and in particular to TrickleUp, we wanted to set aside some of our own resources to commission research to say, we have a hypothesis about what women's digital agency is, but what does it look like? How do we begin to test and learn and probe this concept? And that's the journey we began last year with Quicksand in partnership with the work that we had done with Tata Communications in India. What did that look like? That meant we commissioned a small RFP and shortlisted a handful of firms and reviewed a number of proposals to say, okay, what kinds of organizations are best suited to respond to this topic? Because this isn't just a women's digital financial inclusion conversation. This is a behavioral conversation as well. This is a conversation that's also going to unpack and address social norms. And so I want to tee that up for you all because in some cases, as we talk about digital, we're always thinking, those of us again who have been working on digital for a long time, about what are the frontier innovations that we should pursue. This conversation may kind of frustrate that ambition because in some cases we need to stop and look and say, what's not working? What do we need to course correct for? What do we need to pay attention to as it relates to context? And that's why we were really glad for the approach that Quicksand undertook, which Babitha will also explain in her work. So what we did in this case is we did a little bit of a retrospective analysis. Quicksand has been partnering with Tata Communications since 2016. They've been a longstanding collaborator with us. And in the case of going back to 2016, Quicksand, or excuse me, Trickle Up and Tata Communications were working on the constraint that women face in accessing and using smartphones. That program sunsetted a few years ago. We wanted to say, okay, since that time, a program in which we, Trickle Up and Tata, gave women smartphones, what's happened? What has happened with women's use of smartphones? Are we seeing ongoing organic uptake of digital services? Are we seeing ongoing usage? Are we seeing women replacing the phones after they are lost? And is it leading to increased digital uptake and usage over time? And so that's what we looked at in the context of both Odisha and in Jharkhand as well. And so I'm going to turn it over now to Babitha George to share the insights of the analysis that they undertook. And after that, we'll turn it over to our colleague, Mrs. Pallava Barua at Tata to give us her reflections before we turn it over to discussion. So Babitha, over to you, please.
Thanks, Wendy. Erica, if I could request you to share slides.
Absolutely. Happy to.
Thanks, Ali. So while Ali does that, I can get started. Thank you for being here. We're very, very glad that we're getting this time with all of you who have also probably been thinking about this topic for a while, to share and to learn from each other. Like Wendy mentioned, I am part of Quicksand. We are a people-centered design and research organization. So a lot of what we're going to share today comes from the work that we did with the women in Odisha and Jharkhand. And it really brings their lived experiences and realities to the fore in the insights and learnings that we're going to present today. So over the next 20-25 minutes, I'd like to share a picture of the research that we did with Trickle Up. I think both, like Wendy and Lauren mentioned, this was really an attempt to really understand what digital agency looks like in the lives of women living in poverty in rural India. It wasn't whether they have phones, but what it actually takes for a phone to become something a woman can use on her own terms. Next slide, please. Yeah, thanks. I was very happy to hear Lauren say exactly what we're starting off with. A phone in a woman's hand is not the same as her being able to use it. And this is really at the heart of everything that we're going to share today. When we put a phone into a woman's hands, for a long time, all of us maybe tended to count that as success, access achieved to digital, and therefore we've achieved something. But access and use are often not the same thing. A woman can actually be handed a smartphone and still she might end up making only a couple of calls a week on it because the working phone in the house is actually being held by somebody else in the family, or the money for recharge actually runs out and she has no control over that, or because using it openly might actually invite comment from the neighbors. So, what we came in asking was a more basic question. What does digital agency actually look like in these women's lives? What is it made of? How does it build up? And how does it, in some cases, actually disappear again. And for us, this was about capturing the everyday reality in a lot of these settings. A phone is actually quite precious, it's fragile, it's contested, it's never just available like it may be for a lot of us. So we went looking for what actually produces use. Next slide, please. Most of the work, existing work for a long time in this space, it kind of reads digital engagement as a kind of ladder. First, you get access to the device, then you use it, and then some outcomes follow. This is a useful sequence, and we're building on this sequence. But the sequence has a limit. It tends to place agency within the woman, as if it is really about her skills and confidence alone. What it leaves out are the relationships between these rungs of the ladder. It leaves them quite thin. So it doesn't explain why a woman who has access and sometimes even has the skill may not even use the device. So we shifted the question. Instead of asking what the woman's capabilities alone are, we looked at the conditions that actually produce her digital use. Conditions that include her own capability, yes, but also extend beyond it to her material situation and to the social world that she lives in. If maybe some of you are thinking that isn't this just access use outcome again? It isn't. What we're describing is what also sits between the rungs of that ladder, because we found that that's actually where most of the action is. Next slide, please. Before we jump into the framework, a note about where we did this. We worked with, and so these were in two blocks in Odisha and Jharkhand, quite rural settings. We worked with 93 women who had been part of Empowered across these two very different sites. We chose these two sites along with the Trickle Up team quite deliberately. Sorry, I would also like to qualify that when we say we, this work has been done very much in conjunction with the Trickle Up team, and we've been thinking about this and building this out together. So that's who we is. And we chose these sites quite deliberately because between them, there's actually a range of conditions, including language. So in Odisha, women could actually speak, some women could speak and read Odia. So reading there actually carried them a little way forward on the phone, versus in Jharkhand, the location that we were in, many spoke Santali, which is spoken much more than it is written. So this didn't translate to what they could read on the phone. Also, we didn't just speak to women, we also spoke to husbands, mothers-in-laws, to smart sakhis who were facilitators, part of the program, who taught the women, to shopkeepers in the locality, to community figures, because as you'll see, agency here, digital agency is distributed across not just the woman, her household, but also the community, and it's not held inside one person. So all the conversations that we did happened in the woman's own language in a place that she chose. Just a note to say that we were looking at depth here. This is not about population prevalence. We're not claiming representative percentages. We're trying to understand the mechanisms and how these various conditions combine in real life. And for that, this kind of close qualitative work was needed. Next slide, please. This is just a quick glimpse of, I'm not going to go into the details, but along with interviews, we also use participatory exercises, timelines of when a woman got a phone, lost it, repaired it, relational maps of who helps her, who controls her use. We did also intercept conversations in the shops where so much digital life actually happens. Also, one point to note, this is retrospective. The Empowered program had already ended by the time we did the feed work. So it actually helped us understand in some cases how a woman's use had built up, but in some cases how it had also come apart. Next slide, please. We can skip this. This is just glimpses from the field. Next slide. Yeah, so here is the framework. And we found that digital agency really rests on three conditions. The first is material conditions, the physical and financial basis for any digital use at all. So the phone itself, whether she has a device, whether she has the money to keep it running, the connectivity, the signal, and the electricity that make it work, and her real kind of practical access to the device. The second is individual capability, what a woman can actually do with her phone and her confidence in doing this. This is possibly the condition that's closest to her. And you'll see soon that even this depends heavily on the people around her. And the third is social and normative conditions, the rules, the expectations, the relationships that govern how a woman in her position is allowed to use a phone. And an important thing here is that the rules are not just imposed from the outside. Women actually internalize these themselves and describe them often as sensible and right. So the three conditions here produce agency, and the agency then in turn produce use. We keep use deliberately separate. It's the output, the thing we can see, but not agency itself. Next slide, please. So this is the full framework. We're not going to walk you through each and every line. It's all laid out in the report that we'll share with you. But we wanted to show you the shape of it and how to read it. So there are, like I mentioned, there are these three anchors: individual capability, material conditions, and social conditions. These are along the corners, and each one breaks into the components that you can see label down the sides. Top center is digital agency itself, what the three produce. And to the right, set slightly apart, is use, because that is what agency produces. And like we said, we keep those two separate on purpose. Now, the important part are all these lines that you see. Each line is an intersection, a place where two conditions meet and produce something that neither would on its own. So if we can take just one, phone access on the right, learning process on the left, a phone that a woman actually has steady access to builds skill. A phone she gets maybe for 2 days in a week or a few hours in a day, it does not, because she forgets things between turns. A lot of the skill is built up through practice, sometimes even through pattern recognition. And when she does not have that consistent access, especially in the early learning phase, she forgets between these turns. Now, that's one single intersection, and there are several of them. So we don't need to read every line right now. I think the thing to take away is that this framework is mostly about these meeting points, not the three conditions sitting in isolation. Next slide, please. And I also wanted to kind of share honestly what this builds on. We're not claiming that this is entirely new. The core idea, that outcomes actually the outcome of use emerge from intersections across the levels of a system rather than from any single part. This obviously has a long lineage. It's informed by socio-ecological systems thinking, and that's what this work is also informed by. It builds also on the access use outcome tradition in digital inclusion, and it actually operationalizes Trickle Up's own working definition of digital agency, which is the capacity to access, to use, and to control digital tools. So this is a contribution to a very vibrant existing conversation, and we encourage you to also add to this. Next slide, please. So we just wanted to maybe come back to the point of the intersections between the conditions. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to go into too much detail, but this intersection is what we wanted to emphasize, because our central claim is that most of what determines a woman's digital use, as a result of her agency, it lies not inside any one condition, but in the way the conditions actually push and pull against each other. So, if we take material conditions, like I said, meeting individual capability, this is about access and about learning. Learning to use a phone for a lot of the women, we saw that it was a slow task. It was often a physical task coming from practice and playing around on the device. One of the Smart Sakhis, the facilitators, described it as actually placing the phone in the woman's hand and guiding her fingers through the steps. So she actually said, our own hand guides them, but the mobile stays in the woman's hand. So without practice, this kind of skill fades really fast. Another Smart Saki told us about when there were moments when the woman didn't have access, whatever she had learned, she would again forget. So the form of access really decides everything, not whether there's a phone somewhere in the house, but whether she can actually steadily have access to it. Therefore, a phone of her own allows for skills and capability to really grow and consolidate, versus a phone that's just coming to her periodically, or a phone that breaks and isn't repaired actually undoes this capability. So the point is that two women who might, with the same training but with different forms of access, end up in completely different places. And that's exactly what we need to kind of think about in program design, how we don't just pull a single lever, but the fact how we need to account for how these conditions act on each other and therefore, we need to hold them together in program design. We'll talk about that a little further. We don't have time, but the report actually unpacks each of these conditions and the subcomponents and the intersections in great detail. So we'd encourage you to look at that when we share it. The next slide, please. We wanted to talk about, again, we'll allow you to explore this in more detail, but I wanted to use this opportunity to really describe these three archetypes. These are positions, so they're not types of women, they're not destinations. The same woman might actually move between archetypes, and their movement of digital agency runs in both directions. So, in the first one, the three conditions, material, social, and individual capability, have come together, and they've actually built and grown over time. So she might actually have a working phone that's effectively her own. Her skill has grown well past calling. She uses YouTube, WhatsApp, photos, payments. Sometimes even she's using it to generate income. The social space around her has actually now opened up enough that she uses it, and she sometimes even becomes the person that other women come to for help. A woman told us they come to me to learn how to use the phone for livelihoods. In the second archetype, the conditions had actually come together once, but then it comes apart. The phone has now gone. It's either broken or it's gone back to being with a husband or a son. The skill has weakened from lack of practice, and the social space that her earlier use had opened up has now again quietly closed up again. In the third situation, the conditions haven't even come together at all. So she does not have a personal device. There's very basic capability, and the constraining frame is also deeply internalized. We heard women say, what would I use it for? What would I search for? I'm too old for this. I'm too uneducated for this. So these journey maps that we have here across these three archetypes trace a composite. This is not a single woman story. It's a composite of several women that we met through each path, condition by condition. The full versions are in the report. Next slide, please. But I think the important thing here is that the second archetype, the women for whom the conditions had actually come together and then fell apart, was the largest cluster in the women that we met. So they weren't archetype one, which is really a success story of good digital agency, nor was it the third archetype where the women who really hadn't started. The women who had it and then lost it were the largest cluster. So a woman who might have gotten the smartphone through the program, she learns to use it, gets to using WhatsApp, watching videos, maybe some of the livelihood app that was part of the Empowered program, then something like could happen, like the screen cracking. Repairing it costs maybe 1,000 or 1,500 rupees, and that crosses the line of what the household is willing to spend on her phone. So it actually sits broken, or the phone gets reabsorbed into the family. It becomes a common family phone because the son gets primary use over it because he might be studying on it. Again, her practice stops and her skills fade. The neighbors who might have earlier accepted her using a phone might now go back on that. The small bit of permission that she'd earlier won closes back up. And why does this matter? I think it's really important because almost all the ways in which we measure often digital programs and programs that use digital tracks forward movement from less use to more. But the measure that only looks forward actually misses out on what's happening to several women in situations such as these, maybe after a program ends. I think the point here is that the Empowered program in this case actually did what it set out to do. But the point is about what our usual yardsticks don't sometimes see in the longer term. Backward movement is real, it's common, and we need to measure for it. Next slide, please. So this actually brings me to measurement, and the framework potentially gives us two ways in. The first is a shortcut. Because conditions produce use, we can measure use and get a reasonable read on agency, on digital agency at a given moment, what women do with their phones, how often, and for what. This is fast, it's lighter, and for many purposes, it's actually enough as long as we understand what's happening behind it. But keeping in mind that use is a snapshot on its own, it can't tell us whether the ground underneath this use is actually strengthening and building up, or is it falling apart or going backwards. So a woman whose use is rising might actually be moving on to more durable ground of digital agency, or she might be on a borrowed phone in an arrangement that won't last another month. And measuring use alone can't tell these two apart. So the deeper measure in which we need to track the conditions themselves, think about them. How do we build small sets of observable indicators for each of the three conditions? So does she have access, reliable access to a working device? Is recharge consistent? Can she read enough of the screen to act on her own? Who decides about her use? So three or four indicators that we build per condition. This is harder, but it can only actually, this is the way we can know if the agency is being built, it's actually holding, or it's actually being eroded. And it's also how we can catch the backward movement that we described in archetype 2. Next slide, please. What does this mean for how we design programs? A few things actually follow quite directly. The first is about designing access. If learning can only consolidate when a woman handles a device steadily, then the form of access that we have is a critical decision. It's not just a detail. So, a phone of her own, or one that she can hold reliably, is what actually lets her skills settle. So, partial access to a phone, something that might rotate, etc., we might actually need to think quite deeply about that. This also applies actually to repair as much as to handing out devices. A phone that breaks and isn't fixed produces exactly the same result as a phone she's never had. Second is segmentation. Women in similar contexts might arrive at digital agency from very different starting points, as those three archetypes allude to. The same intervention can land quite differently depending on where a woman starts. So, a program that treats everyone alike will misallocate effort. So, a woman whose access has collapsed needs something quite different from a woman whose access is fine, but whose social conditions still hold her back. And the third is an interesting bit around coverage. What we saw was that several of the social constraints ease simply as phones become more ordinary in a community. Women who once drew some critique or comments for using a phone outdoors told us that the comments have died down now as more women around them have gotten phones. So putting phones into a few hands keeps actually focuses judgment on them. So working at higher coverage in fewer communities actually normalizes having access and using phone. So coverage actually becomes a lever on the social conditions. And our last slide. A critical bit is also a lot of programs include them. This is the community cadre. In Empowered, it was the Smart Sakhis. We've also seen these in other programs. They can actually work in two different modes. She can do the task for the woman, which is substitution, or she can teach the woman to do it herself, which is true skill transfer. And which mode she is in actually decides whether the woman's own capability can grow. And more help can actually mean less learning in some cases. So, if the Saki or even someone in the family, her husband, her son, keeps doing the banking and the other financial things, the task might get done, but the woman never learns it. And the arrangement, even when she actually builds her skill, it tends to, this kind of arrangement tends to stick. So this carries on long after the skill transfer would have worked. So this is something we need to account for. And finally, just the fact that the cadre sits inside this same framework. The Smart Sakhi has her own material conditions, her own capability, and her own social constraints. And those cap what she can pass on. If we want her to build digital agency in others, we have to also attend to her own digital agency. So what we're offering, last slide, we can stop here, is really a way of thinking. It's not in that sense a checklist. It's a lens, a way that we think can help us understand, measure, and design for women's digital agency. And like Lauren said, it is for all of us who are working in this space a starting point. The full report goes much deeper than I've been able to, and we'll share it with all of you. And I'd love to hear comments once, apart from what we have time to discuss today. Thank you, and I'll hand back to Wendy.
Thank you so much, Babita. I think I'm going through like 3 phases of guilt as I listen to the report. And I know it's not what you intended, but so often when we design these programs, we have said the phone is enough, or we walk away and say, because she has a phone, or, all these other things will happen. And your report, I think, brings to mind that there's so much more that we seriously need to pay attention to. We probably all know this. We face pressures as to why we don't pay attention to these factors, but we've also had beliefs formed as practitioners based on where we operate, based on theories of change that work in other contexts. And I think your report gives us pause as to perhaps how we recalibrate. Pallavi Barua is the Director and Global Head of Corporate Social Responsibility at Tata Communications. And as I mentioned at the onset of the call, Trickle Up has really been privileged to partner with Tata Communications for some time now, both as part of our implementation efforts, but also as a thought partner. And so, Pallavi, I would love to just get a few reactions from you as you're listening to these insights for the first time. What are you thinking about as it relates to how Tata is thinking about its partnerships and program opportunities, and any just quick reactions from you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Wendy, and thank you to the entire Trickle Up team and, of course, Quicksand for this wonderful report. It's quite a long report. I haven't managed to go through it entirely, but there was so much insight in the slides that Babita had shared. So just to give you a context, as Wendy mentioned, I'm part of Tata Communications. I head the CSR function. I joined Tata Communications in 2017, and when I became part of the Empowered team, the project was already on ground for 4 years. So it's exactly 10 years now that, the project has been running in different phases. And the basic premise of the project was to provide women with income generation activities, taking into account their current assets and resources. But I was intrigued by the very idea of the project, because the focus was just not on income generation alone. It was income generation for women from ultra poverty communities, aided through smartphones, and on top of that, an app specially built for them, which they can use to basically use diversified livelihoods. I'm sorry to say this, but I was surprised by the audacity of that entire idea that, giving smartphones to women from ultra poverty communities would solve the problem, because I don't know how they would use it. But happy to also let you know that I was, the day I landed in Jharkhand, in one of the states where the project was running, to attend a workshop for training the women on use of smartphones, I was rightly put in my place by them. And what they showed me, these women who were part of this training program, showed me that if you give the power of digital tools in the right manner and in the right requirement that they have, you will see a change. And I'm not talking about just the women's ability to switch on the phone, take a few photographs, take a call, or dial a number. I'm also talking about what Babita was mentioning through the report is, about agency that we have seen that have built over the last 10 years of the project. Of course, the first thought about giving a smartphone to these women was, of course, what if they sell it? What if they give it to their household members? How will we ensure that they're using it? But of course, through working with Trickle Up, the team, and we had ensured that it did not happen, and women came to see these smartphones as assets for themselves. And these women never owned anything of their own. They didn't have land, they didn't have cattle, they didn't have anything in most cases, of course. And the phone became an asset. So one insight that really resonated with me, and since Wendy, you asked that, what I'm taking from this report and from what Babita shared, is that we often measure whether a woman has access to a device or whether she's using a device as the agency, which is actually not what it is. But the more meaningful question is whether she has the confidence, the autonomy, and the decision-making power to use those digital tools that would advance her own goals. And one thing that I've always admired within the Empowered project is, of course, the Smart Sakhi, the cadre that we have of women who have been, training other women to how do they use this phone, how do they use their the app that we have, a package of practices, is of course that, the agency that they've been able to create within other women. At Tata Communications, our experience of working with Trickle Up and the Empowered project is that, the digital tools can create value only when you strengthen a women's ability to make economic decisions, because digital inclusion is important, access to opportunities is important, and how do you navigate those risks also is important. And the real outcome that we see in Trickle Up project, in the Empowered project with Trickle Up, is that it's not the digital usage itself by the women who are using these phones or who are using the app, but whether digital engagement has expanded or, created resilience in her to mitigate risks, to mitigate, disasters, or to mitigate any negative things coming her way, whether she has the ability to, plan her own income choices or the ability to influence decision within the household and the community. Talking about Tata Communications partnership with Trickle Up, we do believe that co-creation is something that we have discovered while working on the project. It's not been just us and Trickle Up working on the project. It's the women who have the actual people who have actually made this project what it is today. and working with these women, the community groups. Uh, we do believe that, we also are a tech company. So we do believe that digital tools create value only when they strengthen, women's ability to make decisions, access opportunities, and of course, navigate certain whatever, daily decisions within the household. Going ahead with Empowered, I think the project is designed for sustainability. It is not a one-time project that you build digital agency and digital access for women and then you move out of it. What we have learned is that it's digital inclusion is not so much a technology challenge. It's more of a systems challenge if you look at it. And also reading from the report by Quicksand, the use of a phone, whether the woman has a phone or whether she is using it, whether she can keep it, afford it, learn from it, use it confidently, and exercise choice over it within our household community and community is more important. And I think CSR programs that are designed that addresses all of this, not just the tool, but also the access and the agency and the outcome, as Babita was mentioning, is something that Tata Communication believes in, that will create more adoption and will create lasting agency for the women as well for the project. I hope that's something I'm able to answer your question, Wendy.
Fantastic. And I really appreciate the candor as well, and that reminder at your last point that this is part of program design and the intent from the onset. We have a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and that's where, because this is set up as a webinar, that's where we are capturing questions for this session. And so I'll just read a few of these out loud. Some are already answered because some people have to leave on a flight, but I'll raise it. One is from Chris Wolf. Beyond agency related to the 3 dimensions research, are there any insights on influence on women's agency based on different tools or use cases using WhatsApp versus IVR? Particularly wondering here the implications for how AI for D needs to foster better agency for women or could hurt it. What principles should be incorporated in the design of the AI tech along with the social context of deployment and implementation or programming? I think that's a question that probably many of us are wondering about as we think about the leveraging of AI tools for this. So just wonder if you have any other reactions to that. And then there's a few more questions I will raise here for now. Also, before you both answer, and especially for you, Babita, I want to note for colleagues who have to leave early, we are going to share the report on LinkedIn on July 1st. So it will be publicly available, and look for the post there. We will also have a recording of this webinar available with resources available. But anyways, Babita, from your vantage point, when we think about deployment of AI tools and we think about this concept of agency, how do we think about reconciling the findings that you have with both the potential of various AI solutions and the limitations as well as it relates to agency?
I think I'll go back to maybe the second point we had in the last slide, which was really understanding that women aren't a homogeneous whole. They are really heterogeneous. Our archetypes kind of allude to that and the different journeys that they're on. And I think Chris's question, particularly about AI, I think it's something all of us need to kind of keep in mind. We've been doing some of this work around women's digital agency in Africa as well. And I think recognizing who could potentially participate and understanding that is really important, because otherwise thinking about AI solutions at this point as a tool for all and sundry, in fact, potentially fosters further exclusion. So being able to really recognize who we're able to reach with AI solutions, or the fact, I think there are a couple of other comments about the roles of others, or to also recognize in the design of these solutions that they aren't often just used by the end user, the woman herself, that there are intermediaries, and therefore all of these other conditions, how her capability is actually accelerated by others around her in some cases, or the fact that social conditions might impact this kind of intermediated use is something I think we need to account for, particularly as we get into design of AI solutions for women in these conditions.
Yeah, it just goes back to these kind of fundamental design principles, is what I'm hearing you with in regard to that. I think a good question comes up from Minji. This comes back to the context. Given that maybe there are some people on this call who will definitely understand the context in which this research was undertaken, but others may not. What kind of stereotypes or comments do women face when they have phones? What would the neighbors say when they cannot accept that they have phones? Can you just create a picture for people who may not be familiar again with the context and what women might experience?
Yes, absolutely. These were both fairly rural locations in India. These are close-knit communities where everyone sort of has an eye on what's happening next door. They're less individualistic. So often people outside the family, outside the immediate family, would have an opinion, especially on women's use of something seen as modern. What some of the most common stereotypes that we saw women encountering was of her being wasting her time. So the manner in which roles are distributed within the home is also extremely gendered. So women's phone use was considered to be acceptable only after all her other roles and responsibilities were done, which is often a never-ending list in itself. So we often found women limiting their use to late in the evening or that little afternoon nap time that they would have had, and use that was seen outside of that and publicly seen. In many cases, phone signals were very poor. Women would have to step out of the house to get a signal. And then seeing a woman outside during the day speaking on the phone was not considered okay because it would be seen as her being too forward, her ignoring her chores, etc. This was the most, obviously, this was, as I mentioned, and as we heard many women say, this was becoming less limiting as the use of phones are becoming more acceptable. But it was also the most stringent with younger unmarried women. There was always this danger that the phone could become a medium in which she meets strangers, could potentially fall in love with somebody, go away from the home, etc. So these were some of the stereotypes that we saw.
Thanks for that. There's a few more questions. And let's see here. Prabhat asked one question that crops up is what is the role of other people in the women's household in building up her digital agency? I guess this ties to the first question. So not only like how do social norms impact digital agency, but are there examples of household members that when we think of program design, for example, that we can engage as part of supporting digital agency? And this ties to what extent individual capability influences digital agency. I suppose this speaks to the archetypes as well.
Yes, I mean, I'm sure all of you can also add to this, but I see also a question about numeracy and literacy. I just want to say
Yeah.
we found that was always a critical enabler for building individual capability. Otherwise, often it was about pattern recognition, so they might not be able to actually make sense. You remember patterns and learn how to use something, and then the minute you're not able to practice because you don't have access to the phone, that goes away. Versus if you're able to actually read and understand what you're doing, that skill tends to stay on for longer. The role of intermediaries was really, really interesting. And we've kind of, while we call the condition individual capability, it's actually much more than just her own capability. The household plays such a critical role. Both as an enabler in some cases by encouraging use helping her learn more. Also, when there was livelihood outcomes associated, when the woman's digital use was associated with better livelihood outcomes, there would be support within the family to help her learn more. So there would be less judgment, there would be less impatience. But on the other hand, there were also kind of embedded patterns that women who were capable actually had internalized, like I mentioned. So this often, we saw this reflected in how financial transactions were done on the phone. The fear of loss, the loss of money, potential loss, the risk around that was too high. So she would end up, it was always done by the man of the household. So even with skills being built up, these patterns kind of remained in several cases. And that sort of substitution or that sort of delegation is often internalized by the woman herself, saying that, my husband goes out and he knows how to deal with all of these transactions. So that bit of it I tend to leave to him. So this complex sort of ecosystem around her and the various situations in which it can play an enabling role, but also be sort of barriers in growth and learning.
Babith, I think there's a few questions related to this. Some are in a different chat that you can't see. But, when we think about this social aspect, and I'll try and combine these into one question, like, is there a type of perception around, if she's using her phone for livelihoods, it's okay, or does it depend on the type of livelihoods? And then another question too, when we look at social norms, are there layers of external factors that are impacting this, such as ageism, ableism, heteronormativity, that are these sort of lenses that may be applied in thinking about these constraints that may impact agency from a social angle? So kind of two
I
different
think,
questions. I tried to morph it into one, but maybe not very elegantly. Over to you.
I think I think like the legitimacy that comes from livelihood activities was across the board when these are families that are living in poverty. So any additional income or even the potential of additional income um, opens up digital use and digital legitimacy. We also heard people say that we need to keep up. This digital use was seen as modern. So we heard women, sometimes even their husbands, saying that we'll get left behind. We're already left behind, but we need to kind of learn and pick this up. But on the other hand, I think what you mentioned in the second part of the question, Wendy, the ageism, ableism, etc. We found this, and this is really at the heart of a lot of what we saw being internalized by the women themselves. So it wasn't only about social conditions that were imposed on them, but what had been imposed on them for possibly a long time, possibly across generations, and thus internalized. So things like, I'm too old for this. What use do I have for this? These were often comments that we heard, particularly among older women participants in the program. There was quite a stark difference between there were the more of the archetype one were definitely amongst the younger women, with less of these things holding them back.
This speaks well to Pallavi's point too, and Pallavi, when you were mentioning starting off with the Empowered program back in 2017, you're basically saying this is not going to work the way you think it is, and it's in part recognizing the fact that there are long-standing norms set in place that have to be unpacked as part of these three conditions that we talked about on the onset of the call: the social normative element, which we've been discussing quite a bit, the individual component, and the material component too. The last question I have, I know there's several we haven't answered, and so when we share the report, you are welcome to reach out to us on LinkedIn. I will and we'll be glad to respond and share contact details too. Comes from Lauren. What factors and characteristics? Well, Lauren, do you just want to ask it?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much. I found this report so fascinating. But I also want to end on a little bit of a positive note. And there were women who you talked about who were able to hold those gains over time. And I was just wondering, what in your research did you find to be kind of some of the key factors, levers, characteristics that made those women able to hold those gains?
Ton of them, Lauren, and especially I think they lie at those intersections when two of these conditions met and therefore reinforced her agency. That was really critical. So I think, again, that's something that we need to look out for. And maybe I think like the most critical thing I want to emphasize on was when we saw capability becoming embedded enough that it began to be shared outwards. That I think is where we all need to set our sights on. Because we heard again, like while there's distributed competence within the family with husbands, sons, children, etc., what we heard women say is that when we're learning with our peers, with other women like us, we feel less shame. We're or somebody else might ask a question that I hadn't thought of. So the power of learning through peers is really, really critical. And I think we saw that in the success of Smart Sakhis as well, who were women like them. There was therefore the potential to reach that. And we saw this with women, particularly in the first archetype, them going on to teach other women. So not just teaching specific skills, but even opening up possibility, telling other women that you can use this as a tool for entertainment, for livelihoods, for all of this. So I think like thinking about building digital agency in a manner that she becomes a focal point for others to learn and grow as well, I think is really, really important and something that we saw.
Thanks so much. And I think I'll use my ability to unmute myself to say, I think one of the other points you made, which I found so powerful, was the importance of depth of coverage within a community. And the ability of that and having other women in the community who are also using the same devices and being public about it to really help influence the social norms that would otherwise inhibit some women. So I found that point in the report to be really powerful as well.
Well, we are at the top of the hour, at least on the west side. I want to thank especially Pallavi Barua and Babitha George for their time and what the insights that they shared with us. And thanks to Lauren as well for your comments. From the Trickle Up side, here's what you can expect from us. I've already mentioned we will have this. This is a recorded webinar. We will share that out. We will also share the report on July 1st. We're doing more work in this domain. We are trying to look at the linkages between digital agency and financial health. So stay tuned for more on that. We are also partnering with CARE to think about quantitative measures for digital agency, and we should have some insights later in the year to show on that front as well. If this is a topic that is of interest to you, though, please contact us. We are keen to partner and collaborate with others because this is a very big conversation, and we know many organizations are working on this from a variety of angles. And so we would be just keen to learn from others on this. I want to thank you all for taking the time, either really early, late in the day, middle of the day, and look forward to hearing from you. Thanks so much.